So unless you want to see me rear eject.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 554 of the Dead Robot Society. I'm Terry Mixon. Joining me, Paul E. Cooley. What are you up to, man? It feels like about forever since we've done an intro.
Forever since we've done an intro?
Feels that way.
Why does it feel like it's been forever since we did an intro? We did one last week.
I can't remember last week.
Don't they make Geritol or something for people of your age? People of a certain age.
Of a certain age.
Of a certain age.
They also make Metamucil, which I'm not so sure would help my memory. But it might. You never know.
I don't know. If you blast ass, you might, unstop everything. Oh, God. Now he's throwing cats around. Do you ever sit in your office and just juggle cats? Do you ever do that?
Yes. That's a dangerous thing. Is you think that, juggling knives is dangerous. Juggling cats is a lot more dangerous.
If they're not declawed, oh, yeah. I completely agree with you. It just sounds like you need one of those those things that dog trainers wear, where the Doberman can come up there and go, not hurt the human being. Yeah, you need one of those with cats.
If you're going to give one a bath, you sure do, but I don't think it's going to be enough.
Ooh. Well, that's not true. We gave Frankie a bath, I think like the third week we had her, because she got really just... She had one bath. She never needed another one.
She says, I got it from here,
yeah,
human.
She was like, oh, okay, so if you're going to do that to me, all right, fine, I'll get with the program. Yeah, no more hygiene problems after that.
So what have you been up to, man? Tell me you've got, a novel in the can. Surely you've got something done.
I'm still working on Trident stuff, and I've also written 7,000 words.
That's great.
On a new book. So, in fact, we talked a little bit about that today during the pre-show. I just didn't point out what it was. But I'm spending some time working on space station designs, mining facility designs, and ship designs because, I suck at it. I need to get better at it. And so this was a wonderful opportunity to kind of dive into that madness.
Well, your dad is kind of a mechanical engineering sort of type guy. Maybe you should run this past him, right?
He's not a mechanical engineer. He's a chemical.
I didn't say he was, but he's got an engineering background. Maybe he's a good source to run this past. No?
I don't
Bad
think
idea?
No, I don't think his physics knowledge is really going to help me out here. Probably not. Anyway, that notwithstanding, that's what I've been working on, as well as trying to get. I have a whole pile of new paying work that just hit my email, so I'll be getting that stuff done over the next couple of weeks. But I'm hopeful that I can, spend 2 hours a day working on the new book and working on Trident, and I have to start recording soon for patrons and getting all that done. So I've still got a shit ton of work I have to do, but right now it's one of those up periods where I'm actually able to do stuff and my brain isn't getting in my way. So brain chemicals aren't getting in my way. So I need to strike while that iron's hot. But I'm really excited about this book, so I just needed to make it happen. What about you, sir? What the hell have you been up to?
I haven't written as much as I want to because there's just been a lot of things going on the last couple of days. But I've written every day, so that's a good thing. I'm trying to build up a streak of at least getting 250 words a day, even when I don't really have time to write. I updated my monitor in my office and updated my video card, and that took a lot of playing around to get things to work. But as far as productivity, I took a break in writing the Empire novel that I'm working on to finish writing the short story for the last anthology that I owe something. I still have to do the last read through and edits on paper, but it's done. The draft is written, so the story's down. It's finished. I had my novel Blood of Patriots out for pre-order, and it went live this morning.
Yay!
So lots of sales came in through that all at one time. So a nice little spike there. We'll see how, now that the people in Kindle Unlimited can get their hands on it. We'll see how that plays with the rankings and what it does. I'm curious to see how that experiment comes out. I think that's it.
What a boring life we lead.
What a boring life I lead.
We both lead boring lives.
What can I say? My wife wants to rearrange the house, so I have to, set aside lots of hours to rearrange things.
Ain't going to say a damn word.
Because if the situation was reversed, it would be you doing it.
Yep.
That's just one of those things we both have to nod about and go, yep.
Yep. That's called being married. Yeah. Anyway. Hopefully I won't get too much hate mail for that that stuff.
Oh, well, it'll be fine. Whether you're male, female, gay, straight, whatever, when the spouse says, I need something, you're going to take aside the time to make it happen.
Yeah. Especially when they hold a gun to your head.
That's a totally different kind of relationship.
You're right. No, usually
if you were in that kind of relationship, call 911 immediately.
Yeah. No shit. So that's all you had to report?
Is there something that you're thinking of that I'm missing?
No.
Because it's possible.
No.
So, Paul, today, I think you're going to be pleased because we've got a guest that I've followed for a while, that I've read a number of his books, and I can't wait to talk to him and see what his perspective on writing is, because he's a trade pub author, and that's a totally different experience than either one of us has.
True.
And he's a really smart, funny guy. And I've got nothing other to say than, folks, let's welcome Charles E. Gannon onto the show. And everybody, stand by for a great time. Today is Chuck Gannon. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's my real pleasure to be here.
I have to say that I've been familiar with your work for a long time because I've been reading books from Baen, it seems like about the year 2000. I was reading them on my pocket PC, the ebooks, when I didn't go into the store and get them. And I've read most of your Kane Reardon stuff, and I've read other things as well. I just can't put a finger on one of them. I read too much, apparently, so I can't remember which books I've read anymore. But I remembered I enjoyed the heck out of them. And I really appreciate you joining us because it's a real pleasure.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and we can talk about all. I'm also just interested in, since this is a show talking with writers, about writers, for writers. I'd like to hear some of your own, experiences as writers, as where your own hopes are, where your own projects are. If there are any sorts of questions you get from audience members on a routine basis, please feel free to toss them on in.
Sure.
Ooh, wow.
We tend to get a lot of questions along that line, but they tend to be very much entry-level questions. We try to address any higher-level ones in the show itself as we go along. Mm-hmm. Paul and I we're basically indie writers. We didn't start with traditional publishing. I've written 15 books of my own and 5 co-authored works in the last 5 years. So I'm starting to pick up how this works, at least from the indie side.
And certainly from the productivity side. I wish I could make a claim like that.
Well, I didn't really have a choice. NASA said, congratulations, we're laying you off. And I said, oh, gosh, what am I going to do now? And I had already written a couple of books at that point, and I made this jump successfully to writing and supporting and paying my mortgage. So I can't complain.
No, absolutely. You are in a very small minority in our field.
Yes, you are.
I have no idea how I got to the point that I am, but the last 2 years I've had a 6-figure income from my writing, and I cannot complain because that's very rare, and I know it is.
Yeah. I should be interviewing you.
If only I could give you any answers as to why anything works. For those of the listeners that don't know who you are, could you go ahead and give yourself an intro?
Oh boy. So I am a full-time writer. I write mostly for Baen. I have publications in a couple of other imprints. Most of what I write to date has been hard science fiction, although I'm probably almost as well known for alternate history in Eric Flint's 1632 universe, Ring of Fire. I've written in the Starfire universe. I've written in, my gosh, if you take a major Bane sort of shared world situation going all the way back to War World, for those who remember that, I probably have taken a whack at it at some point. So I was in War World. I was in Man Kazin Wars. I've been in the Honorverse. I've written in Starfire novels, and I've written 1632 novels. And so, and I know I'm forgetting some, and I apologize to anybody who would take offense at that. But that's most of what I do, and I love doing it.
Let's get to the real important question, though. How many times have you killed Joe Buckley?
Well, so far only once. But I had a plan that was going to do it more frequently, and I can't. I know where I was going to do it. I can't give it away, but there's a tribute anthology that is in the offing, which is going to involve cloning, alien invasion, and Joe Buckley, and I will rack up the biggest Joe Buckley body count that has ever been imagined.
Oh, that sounds
awesome.
like something I would do.
That is so awesome.
Oh boy, I have.
Does everybody on your channel know what we're talking about with Joe Buckley?
We've mentioned him several times before because there's a number of our listeners, at least one of them, who wants to try to get an equivalent body count to Joe Buckley. So he's come up before in the conversation.
Okay, all right.
We all have toe tags that we love to drag from book to book. So I've been killing Thomas Reed since 2011, 2009, 2008. I don't know how many times I've killed him. He's a toe tag. Terry has people. I have people who pay to be a toe tag. I'm sure Terry has several people who bug him into being toe tags. But yes, I'm looking at you, J.R. Handley. And,
he does. He bugs me to this.
Yes. So it's kind of a fun thing to carry on.
It is.
And it's fun to try to make the deaths as ridiculous as you possibly can while still fitting inside the story.
Yep.
I know that somebody killed him in a space opera by having a space toilet fall on him while he was in a bordello before he actually sealed the deal.
Why?
One hardly knows where to go with that story.
How do you follow that?
I don't know how you follow that. I think
what you do is what Joe didn't do. You avoid. Okay, you dodge. So no, I don't. I got nothing, man. I got nothing. Okay.
How did you? I'm a person that came into writing late. I'm a disgruntled reader that back 10 years ago I decided I'm not seeing the kind of stories that I want to see, and I said I held up a book and specifically said I can write something better than that, and then proceeded to learn what I had to do it. How did you become a writer? Are you one of the ones that knew earlier on that you wanted to be a writer?
Yeah. There was a part of me that knew I wanted to be a writer before I understood that was a profession. The short version of that puzzling sounding story is that when I was 3, I wanted to be a paleontologist and deal with dinosaurs and write about it. And then I wanted to be a zoologist and deal with animals. For some reason, I was taken with wolverines. I admired their ferocity and tenacity, I suppose. And I wanted to write about it. And then I wanted to be an astronomer, and I wanted to write about it. Then I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to write about it, but ooh, that's dangerous. And so I came out of that, and it was sometime right about after that I realized that what I wanted to do was write about cool things. I didn't want to do those cool things, 99% of which are essentially isolating tasks, many of which are performed in laboratories or the vomit comet for those of us who are more kinetically gifted, I suppose. So I knew I wanted to do these cool things. I wanted to be able to go and explore them and mix them however I wanted. And I wanted to be able to tell the stories about what it would be like. I guess the sense of wonder, if you will, that was resident either right on the surface or down latent in all of them. And so at 12 years old, I realized that and commenced to knock off a really, I thought, tremendously original, but now years have shown me that it was a poorly disguised and poorly executed semi-Star Trek homage. And that's how I got started. And I really never looked back. It was, and wouldn't you know, the first thing I tried to write was a novel. You know,
You're not alone.
You're right. but
that's the first thing. That's the first thing I wrote. I hadn't wrote a short story by the time I wrote a novel.
Yeah, right. There you go.
I could tell you that one thing, working in a field like being somebody that works for NASA, I am living proof that you do not have to be a rocket scientist to work for NASA, because I worked in the Mission Control Center for 16 years as an IT guy. And there's a lot of really smart people there.
Yep.
And I had imposter syndrome the entire time I was there, because I did not think I was as smart as everybody around me.
Yeah. I think the only people in those environments who don't have imposter syndrome are the arrogant people who will get hit by the bus because their nose is so high in the air.
The scientists I love to kill.
So the earlier part of my career was as an academic. I was also born a Catholic, so I suppose this is my confessional streak coming out now. But that was actually a good experience as well in terms of what it taught me, and also, I guess you could say, people who are indeed very full of themselves. Not all, but once again, I would say the best professors I knew were the ones who were also they were also lifelong. What you were saying about individuals who think much of themselves and who don't have imposter syndrome. Yeah, there's plenty of that around, God knows. But, you know, I find that people in those fields, for the most part, are I find they're actually receptive to new information. At least I've been fortunate that way. Most of my exposure, for instance, the Kane Riordan books, when I put those books together and I actually constructed that character, I thought about, there were two groups of people I had in mind who I kind of was hoping would see themselves a little bit in that character. One are science fiction fans, simply because I find that if they are minds forever voyaging. I mean, why would you choose real science fiction if you're not? It is an endless cornucopia of the possible, and that's an extraordinary opportunity.
I know what my writing process is. I get about 4 or 5 books a year out of what I'm doing in my process. How many books a year do you write as a traditional author?
It depends. That answer is not intended to be evasive. It is when you do have kids, and when you are in your 50s and health issues are starting to come in that require, that don't get solved immediately. I've gone from any place from writing 3 to barely 1 1/4, which has actually been probably the greatest challenge in my career right now, because in order to make this work, you need to sort of hit a beat. You need to hit a stride, and you need to be able to pace it out, and that has been difficult. And then that, it doesn't go away as soon as the problem goes away, because the issue is, as the release time gets pushed back, that means that the time to eventual, earn out and therefore royalty payments gets pushed back, and whatever your grand plan is now in ruins and tatters. So my evasive answer, or my I guess nebulous answer, is also kind of my attempt at illustrating some of the things that perhaps, when people are thinking about what would it be like to be a writer, once you arrive, so to speak, you have different issues, and it's not as crucial. It's similar, I think, to a problem that a lot of my friends as indie authors, they report this notion that, God forbid, you fall off your production for 4 to 6 months, because while they may love your work, they are looking to scratch that itch. And for every indie author selling something out there, there are probably a dozen others that they're only not trying because right now they're happy with what you're putting out. And if you don't put that out, that's the excuse for them to go and try one of those authors, and you can find your readership vastly diminished by a 6-month hole in productivity. Mine is not that immediate, which is one of the safety factors of being working in traditional publishing overwhelmingly. But still, timeline is all important. I think if any career illustrates that time is money and irreplaceable, it's being a writer has got to be right up there with the top occupations in which that's true.
Same is true in indie, because even though we're being paid more quickly than traditional publishers do, there's still a gap between when something sells and when we get paid for it. In the case of Amazon, it's 60 days. So I just published a new book. It's on pre-order now. It'll go live, and if I start seeing the money, I can't say, oh, we're doing good, because the book I'm writing now will be what fills the gap 3 months down the road.
Right.
So it is a challenge for all of us to do exactly that.
Absolutely. As I said, I think folks in traditional have it a little easier. On the other hand, we have what I would call a sort of constrained distribution of outcome, by which I mean, as long as you're selling through reasonably well, or I should say earning out. I think sell-through as a metric is largely, we're retaining it because we don't know something to replace it with yet. But right now, ebooks have made the notion of sell-through, which is really all about physical measurement of literally physical books, is a metric that is utterly fungible. By which I mean, if you don't sell through, and this happened with one of my first 1632 books, they published it at the rate that they had been publishing other first release hardcovers in the series. And it really did not sell through well. However, it did really well in ebook. And that was one of the moments when the shift was taking place, I'd say from about 2010, 2011 through to about, we were seeing the sea change, I think, arriving and settling more or less by 2014. But in that period of time, if you don't have sell-through now, what do? They simply drop the numbers that they actually produce. Doesn't mean they're going to make less money. They'll actually make more money because those electrons are pretty cheap to recycle. And, that's really where they're making their money. I'm selling, I think I make about, for every dollar I make in hard copy, I probably make 3 to 3.5 in electronic. And that's traditional publishing. So there you go.
One of the things that may be different from traditional publishing to indie publishing, the series that I mainly write in now has 10 books in it. And I can see the read-through straight off of the information that I get from Amazon. If I sell a book one, what percentage is going to make its way through to reading all the way down, and how much is a single sale in book one going to be worth to me when looking at the entire series? And that's something that's just, I've only been exposed to that concept maybe less than a year, and it's a real eye-opener. Yeah.
Your ability to hook return readers is absolutely crucial. And that's probably one of the reasons why I'm just very grateful. I have a lot of folks who are always pestering me for that next Kane Riordan book, and they can't come out fast enough. And that's one of the reasons why. I don't know if you guys know this. It was announced at LibertyCon that do you folks know Chris Kennedy?
I do. I've written 6 or 7 short stories for his anthologies.
And I've been over the anthologies. So yeah.
So it was announced at LibertyCon. I don't know if you guys were able to survive the night of the long knives for scalping the tickets, because it almost got to be that. And it was that again. Do you know they sold out in less than 30 minutes?
I have tickets for me and my wife for this next year. I made the cut. I survived.
You did. You made it. You did indeed. And so at this LibertyCon, it was announced that, and this was worked through a variety of levels. I sort of floated the concept with Chris, who I think mulled it over for an immense nail-biting 14 seconds before he said, "I'm in." And he was trying to interrupt me for the first 10. But it's called Murphy's Lawless, and there's a lot of what I would call ripping yarn potential in the Kane Riordan series that I have not, that there's no way to really capitalize upon given the rate at which it's already releasing the main arc novels. there's a lot of other potential in there. So I went to Chris and I said, let's do this. And the descriptor on this basically is essentially Kelly's Heroes meets Band of Brothers in space. So if you're read up through book 4, you will know who the lost soldiers are, who were essentially pilfered. They were hijacked from various parts of 20th century conflict, and they're the ones who are going to wind up having to fight this war. And
sounds a bit familiar to me. So I think that I think I have read it. It may have been too long.
Kane's Mutiny has been out now about 2.5 years, but the new one, Mark of Kane, of course, is out right now. It was a national bestseller first week of release. That's now 10 days ago. So fingers crossed. Hopefully things will. Yeah, those were my fingers crossed. That wasn't another gesture.
Sure. That's what you say now.
That's right. Yeah. And so I'm just hoping that that will continue. They are scheduled to continue to roll out, but this is an opportunity to bring in other folks. I'm really doing sort of bookends. I'm working as I guess you would say, the editorial packager on that. But the folks who are actually doing the writing are going to be Chris Kennedy himself, Mark Wandry, Casey Izell, Griff Barber, Mike Massa, and my friend Kevin Eichenberry.
I know everybody that you've mentioned, and they're all great writers.
Yeah, so that's that's an example of me trying to actually put my foot also in the indie side of things, or the semi-indie side of things, but with Tony Weiskopf's express approval. I think one of the things I like about Baen as a publisher, they were the first to understand the potential resident electronic books. They were the first to understand that there's a lot of ways to capitalize upon things like no one was selling ARCs, right? Advanced reader copies. And enough people pestered Jim Baen, and he said, well, what's it worth to you? There's an income stream that no one else to this day has jumped on. And in this case, I think there's an understanding at Baen that the series, I think, become increasingly important. I think it's in our television. I think it's kind of what I would call a cultural trend. Binge watching has only further underscored that. And right now, in order to keep up, I think it's funny because I spoke to Chris and Mark at HonorCon in 2016 when this was all a baby idea, kind of. And we, one of the things that we talked about, one of the things that I had observed in the market was it's all about velocity. It's all about not having a lot of gaps. And that model has clearly served them very well. And the way they managed to make that happen, of course, was distributing the project over enough writers that there's never a gap. So I looked at that in sort of from my own model, and I said, while that's not my primary model, I could see how a hybrid of that would really work to explore and utilize some of the best stuff that's latent in the Kane Riordan universe. So that's what's happening, and we're in the process. As a matter of fact, I was just on the phone with them today, working out some of the details about how and when and who.
Yep, I've watched them. I think it's been I wrote the first short story for them 1.5 years, maybe 2 years ago, and I've seen how they've done their universe, and it's made me turn to somebody that I know that is a good writer, that maybe to explore some of my own universes, little nooks and crannies as well. So there's something to having your name appear and a book and a series appear in a short period of time and keep the interest up. There are algorithms online that make that promote that kind of visibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I write space opera, and we were talking, you were mentioning, derivative as something, the first thing that you had written. And I kind of make my living on derivative because I write the kind of adventure stories that I read back in the 80s, and I just update them. And I please myself because that's what I want to read. And I'm lucky enough to have an audience that wants to read that sort of thing with me.
Yeah.
How do you go about this is a complex question. I don't need to know the post office box your ideas come to, but I'd absolutely love to know how you take an idea and you refine it and see how it compares to what the rest of us do.
I don't.
You're a pantser like me.
No, not at all. Not in any way a pantser.
Don't put words in his mouth, Terry.
That's getting back to our dysentery conversation, I think now. Oh, you lucky viewing audience that wasn't around for that part of the show. But what happens for me, first of all, I grew up with much the same sort of science fiction. I grew up loving many of its premises. I also have then become, I would say, relieved seeing that I would say the standards of prose have moved forward a little bit. I'm interested in updating. I'm not saying there was anything wrong with the fiction of the 60s or the 70s. It was appropriate and was working for its time, and it sold very well. But there's a reason we tend not to read books that are, darn close to half a century old, because things have moved along, culture has changed, language has changed, expectations have changed. And if you go back to the 50s and the 60s, serial television actually was kind of new. Certainly something like Star Trek. Serial television comedies were still large. Many of them were still live to tape, studio audience. And now we're living 50 years on from that, where there's all sorts of pace that has, I think, changed our ecology and our identity as consumers of narrative. I mean, games, for instance. If anybody doesn't play a game, or any game whatsoever, perhaps they are not used to what I would call the really short cycle time between essentially desire and gratification. Because a video game which does not have a really, really fast cycle time in that is not going to go anywhere. You can maybe find a couple of indie games which are built for, I think, rumination almost more than play, that do not reward and do not care about essentially twitch muscle speed and accuracy. But that's not the majority of what's out there. That's not what's selling multi-billions of dollars every year. And we're binge watching. I'll go to that again. I mean, the bot that you can now, when we grew up, to date all of us as being just slightly this side of the the invention of electricity. And now there weren't loud laughs. I understood that. It was like I knew I was going to make any friends with that one. But at any rate, the thing is that we have moved from a time where books came out at a much slower rate. You would have to wait you'd have to wait a long time for a season. You had to tune in for each show. So darn many things have changed that I think that narrative consumers have changed. And in consequence, when you say, how do I think about what other people are doing? How do I look at my ideas in light of that? This long tangent is to explain that I actually go a lot to the past in terms of, I think, tropes which are getting underused right now. I think there's a lot of value in tropes from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And I think what's happened is they've become so associated with what I will call the remnants or still the flower of purple prose of what are now cultural anachronisms, that there's a gold mine, essentially, I believe, in simply saying, well, let's just look at the narrative elements and uncouple it from all the cultural baggage and even the stylistic baggage we associate with that. And you know what? So far, that's working out pretty well in the Kane Riordan series, because in a lot of ways, that's what I've done. When you talk about ideas, there are two different kinds of ideas, I guess. One would be if you're talking about story arc or if you're talking about world building. Because those two things, it's a two-lane highway, but for me, there's a very high median between the two of them. And
there should be.
Pardon me? As there should be, you said?
Yes, there should be.
Yeah. So, and I absolutely echo that. So let me ask you, Paul, when you say as there should be, what motivates you to say that?
because I as a reader, I don't really enjoy stories that are so hooked up on the world that they don't actually have characters in them. And
Okay.
I find all too often, especially in epic fantasy, oh boy, here comes the hate mail. That was a kind of a feature of a lot of epic fantasy books, and it just bored the crap out of me as a reader. I want the characters, I want the narrative. If the narrative isn't good, it doesn't matter what the world looks like.
Yeah.
Are you hating on Tolkien again?
I did not say a damned word about he who must not be named.
Okay.
I know that for me, in middle school back in the 70s, when I walked home, I walked past a used bookstore, and as you can imagine, the used bookstore I bought most of my stuff from, it was everything ranging from the 30s to the 50s and 60s is what I
Sure.
was buying to read, and I don't ever go back and reread them again because I've learned that's a painful lesson in how my memory of how much I enjoyed something is different than the actual experience of trying to reconsume it now that I am older. But I go back and I take the touchstones, the story elements, the character elements, the adventure, and I take what I remember of them, and that's what I take and put into my stories.
Yeah. The reason I say that there needs, in my perception of an idea generation, why there's a high median between the two is there is that part which Paul was mentioning, which I see in science fiction too, which in the age of the internet, one would think that an author would realize that probably about only 20% of your fan base is really going to be interested. They're the uber fans who want to see all the spreadsheets. They want to see they want to learn Quenya, all of that sort of stuff. That's not most people. And in the age of the internet, you can have this wonderful magical thing called a website, and it can all be there. Yes. Or you can trail some of that in the water of Facebook and see who pops up and how interested they are and satisfy. You can essentially you can narrowcast that part of your development, but there's no reason for it to all be loaded into the books, and certainly not all the equations done painstakingly. Like knitting needles driven through eardrums and eyes for people who just don't want to see that or hear that. And that's one of the things I've tried to do in my series. But there's another way that I like that median, which is there's way too many times when I've watched what would be expedient for the narrative arc or for character development to begin to, you can see where an author has said, well, wouldn't it be cool if, and all of a sudden the shapes of the world that were largely immutable begin to waver a bit because they've got to in order to make room for this cool thing. And this is a moment where it strikes me that the traffic in the character and the narrative lane is actually compromising the world. And my feeling is the real richness for me, the fun of writing is you take a scenario, that scenario being the world, whatever that means, and you accept it with limitations. As a matter of fact, I'm always asking, what are the limitations? That's one of the reasons why, the Kane Riordan universe is marketed as space opera, and I'll go with that because that's a huge label, and I like to be associated with a big genre. But frankly, if it has 10% space opera, that's a lot. It's 90% still hard SF in most of its mannerisms and the limitations and all of that, if you will. And the reason I'm focused on limitations is because limitations are what makes drama. They're limitations by their very way we use that word. It suggests something that human beings will strive against. We call that, the dramatic crucible. I like that. I like more of that. I don't want to have a paucity of it. And I don't want to see those limitations get wiped away a little bit, or we get that somebody gets a free pass on those simply because that would be groovy for the character arc. No, that's bad planning. You should still be able to use that moment. You should still be able to have that groovy twitch in the character arc, but you may have to think a little bit harder to find out how you're going to make that work in the world you've built with the limitations that you've put there. So I'm real. I do like that division between my chocolate and my peanut butter. So there you go.
Absolutely. I know that when you're reading a story and you're consuming it, the fun parts are where the things that you can't do come into
Yeah.
mind. The struggle to overcome whatever obstacle it is, whether it's a physical obstacle that the world just doesn't allow it, trying to finesse it so that the character has to work for it is what makes a story enjoyable.
I absolutely agree. I am about to embark upon, as a matter of fact, I would say, so I'm finishing up. I'm putting together, I guess you could say, the way forward, the waypoints forward for the Murphy's Lawless branch off in the Kane Riordan universe. I'm finishing up the second half of a book. I'm not writing it with John, but I'm writing it in John Ringo's Black Tide Rising universe, which is called At the End of the World. Then I do another 1632 novel called No Peace Beyond the Line. And then lastly, and then I get around to starting something I've been waiting a long time to start, which is called The Broken World. And that is an epic fantasy which has more than a little bit of slipstream in it, as far as genre blurring and expectations. But one of the things that I'm going to find particularly interesting, I think challenging about writing a fantasy is, one of the things about science fiction is you have things like gravity, the periodic table of elements, a variety of physical laws that, yeah, we call them hypotheses, but, you know, we haven't seen them broken yet, so far as we can tell. And that gives everybody sort of a sense of where you're grounded. The thing about a fantasy world is, how do you know? There's nothing we take away from the real world which tells us what are the limits of what seem to be magic. There's that. You have to set that benchmark up, and you generally probably can't do it by starting, with the arch wizard of the realm explaining all of the different limitations. I mean,
please don't.
That's another. Pardon me. Go ahead.
Please don't.
You're right. You can be sure I'm not. As a matter of fact, I will go so far as to say magic in the Broken World is not exactly magic. And I never forget science. Science is, the bottom line. I don't ever see myself writing fantasy of the high fantasy fairy variety, FAERIE, simply because in that realm, it's part of the sense of wonder there is, and then another unexpected thing happened. And there might be a sense of what I will call the preservation of energy and matter, or the notion that every action has to have an equal and opposite reaction, but maybe not. And that's great. And to me, it's like a fairy tale. But even the better fairy tales generally have a sense of proportion. You don't get to do anything you want to anytime. And that's one of the reasons why I don't ever see myself writing in that sort of high fantasy environment, because I find it difficult to validate senses of urgency. And why would anybody believe in a plan when basically what's happening again and again and again is we learn that the rules we think we see, the rules we assume we can take from our own reality, are in fact subject to alteration or transcendence there, as the case may be. It's the same. The only thing that I can think of that like that sort of in science fiction is the transporter in Star Trek. I mean, I'm a tech guy, yay tech, but I'm with Bones. That damn thing killed more people and caused more problems than any other thing in the series, until, of course, and I'm an OTS guy. I'm the old series, OST, I guess. But then we got to the what was it called, the holodeck, and I was like, this is okay. All order is out for noon recess now, and it's never coming back. So now the hate mail will come in for me, I'm sure. But and it's not like that series didn't have great moments. But once again, I kind of think these are all narrative. I can explain it. I can kind of excuse it in the original series simply because going down by shuttle, unless you wanted to show that same tired footage every damn show, was going to break your bank. The special effects were just that expensive back then. And the thing about the transporter is you got away from that. And woo, science.
It's also time. It was also about time, how long it would take to get to the planet, how long it would take to get back.
Absolutely. Although we do have these things called cuts, you know.
Yes. But the problem is with TV that kind of reality would actually hurt the urgency, I think, of how they put that together. So reality was sacrificed the moment you had a warp drive anyway. Come on,
just cross circuit from A to B and get it over with. All right.
There you go.
Looking at fantasy magic, even though it's been a number of years since I've read the series, and I know I'm far behind in what's there, I still remember Raymond Feist's Midkemia novels, his magician novels. And that magic system still, even though I can remember very little about it, at the time I was reading it, it struck me as a good balance between being powerful and being limited.
Yeah.
There's always a cost.
I beg your pardon?
As long as there is always a cost, as long as there is no free lunch.
Yeah. And that's very much what I'm working with. And I think it will not, I did something in the, I'm going to prove that I do not learn from experience. They're making me a very, very questionably, my success as an evolutionary experiment is very questionable. But
Darwin is listening.
Yeah, I know. Always is. But one of the things, for instance, that I did in the Kane Riordan novel was I inverted what I would call one of the typical hero progressions, which is you start out with the noob who doesn't know how to do anything, and they get better and better and better. I specifically, and the number of people who instead saw a merry stew and then didn't come back to see what was happening as the series progressed, is somewhat frustrating, because I wanted to start him in an environment that was really kind of his wheelhouse. But what happened was, as he succeeded there, and he got put into more situations that were further and further away from his wheelhouse, the successes became more questionable, they became more costly, and they became, just in the final analysis, bloody more uncertain. Because there are reasons for that. And all I'll say is the citizen soldier experience of World War II. You want to come back to it? We can come back to it. But the reason I'm saying I'm not learning from my mistakes is that clearly a lot of people went away thinking, oh, well, so now this character is going to be good at everything. No, he was better at more things in the first book than he has been in any book since, even though he's running as fast as he can to catch up. And something similar to that is probably going to happen in Broken World. A lot of people are going to look at that and they say, I don't understand what the magic cost is. Where's the magic cost? And I'm for those few who are listening, I'm going to say, and I think my image went away, but hopefully the gesture will come back. And it will be, wait for it. Wait for it. There's a very big cost. But it is not immediately evident. And that's part of how I guess you could say there's at the same time that I love a lot of the tropes of fantasy, there's a part of me that is hoping to stand a bunch of them on their heads. And
I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm doing in the Broken World. The guy who thinks he might be a chosen one is chosen to be anything but, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that. But the long answer is I'm very much a plotter, except when what happens is I'll be thinking about a book. For instance, I wrote Mark of Cain, the one that just came out. I started writing that late in the fall, seriously in the fall of 2017. And it got interrupted a whole bunch of times by health issues and other things. And so I finished it finally with all the revisions just earlier this year in February. It was the book that actually had more revisions than any other that I've ever written, and they were correct. Toni Weisskopf said, I don't know about this, and she was absolutely right. So editor, publisher, and friend, and not necessarily in that order at all. But the thing is that I was already while I was writing that book, at that point I was taking most of my notes, because I take audio notes, I'll write notes on the computer, I'll dictate to the phone, whatever the case may be. I was making them mostly for the Broken World. and for the Ringo novel, and for the 1632 novel that I will be starting after. And so what happens is I collect all these ideas. Some of them have to do with world building. Some of them have to do with plot. I almost never have a note that deals with both. The divide is present even when I'm sort of free associating. But in the course of that, what happens is, so then it comes time to write the novel, and I sit down and I'll have tons of notes, and I'll just start entering them. I don't do a chapter by chapter breakdown, but I get a sense of what the arc is going to be, and I start dropping them into the places in the arc, and then I kind of get senses of what I'll call larger dramatic beats. They may be a single chapter, they may be 3 or 4 chapters, but I stop dropping them in there. Then I kind of see what order they're going to want to take. A lot are going to self-select out to a later book or for some other project because they just don't fit. But that's what I'm left with. I don't have a chapter outline. I may have pieces of written dialogue because that's part of the tsunami. I can be sitting there and I can be thinking, and I'll be writing, and this happens all the time. I'm writing the most recent novel, and I suddenly see a scene from a novel that's 1 or 2 down the track, and I just break, write, then I'll just simply start a new file, pull that out, throw it in that new file, label it to the book that it's going to go into, and go back to work on what I was working on. Because my notion is when it's flowing, don't stop it. Just run with it. Wherever it is, run with it. If you cork it, it generally doesn't turn into wine. It generally turns into vinegar. So my tendency is to do that. So by the time I'm writing a novel, I've done a lot of pantsing. I've done a lot of plotting, but the pantsing comes in as I move from moment to moment. Almost all the dialogue, most of the actual writing, that is taking place in the moment. And I kind of like that model because I feel like I'm discovering it along with the reader. So there's freshness, even though there was a lot of advanced plotting involved. And I know Terry's probably read most or most all of them. There's always the arc, and then there's the mystery. Every single one of the books has a mystery, and I would probably lose more weight than is healthy if I decided to write a mystery as a pantser. I don't.
I've done this under a pen name. Allow me to assure you, if you just go ahead and write it so that everyone is guilty and don't decide which one it's going to be until the end, it works fine.
I'm doing that.
Probably joking there.
I'm doing that with a derelict.
I got that. Same thing. Yeah, don't try that at home, kids. Don't try that at home.
Why not? It's fun watching your blood vessels burst and keeping yourself up at night over the decisions you made before and now the decisions you have to make to get to where you need to go and not knowing where that is.
I try not to live a life where I find myself deeply, fiercely, and with good reason hating myself. So I don't do that.
I have an uncanny knack for it. I don't know why. I just do.
There was a mystery that I read that it was something that I had never seen in a book before, and I don't recommend anyone try it. It was a murder mystery from the first person point of view, and at the end of the book, you find out that the person that's the point of view is indeed the killer, the one that's investigating it, and it's just suddenly introduced like this character has never thought of before. Oh, wait, yeah, I killed that guy. Do not do that. Do not do that.
A troublesome reveal. Truly so. A troublesome reveal, yeah, I would say.
Oh, is that the technical term for it, as opposed to phoning it in?
The tentacle term, did you say?
I said technical. Don't go technical.
Well, tentacle works for his fiction, though.
Tentacle can work for Black, yes. Well, and derelict. I have a thing with tentacles. Terry's trying to get me to write tentacle porn, but it's just not going to happen.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing, I think. Yeah.
Tentacle erotica sounds like Chuck Tingle.
Yeah, let's avoid that. What advice would you have for folks in the listening audience? Because I know that a lot of them are trying to do the tea leaves. They can read any number of writing books to give them advice on doing things. We want to hear what your writing book would be about.
Well, first of all, I would aim them at a book by the American novelist John Gardner called On Moral Fiction, even more than on becoming a novelist. And on moral fiction probably sounds like it's going to be some tired, post-Aristotelian rehash of why write. But he really, I think, nails, in talking about moral fiction, he's talking about conviction, personal conviction, whatever that may be. And I think if I was going to give anybody advice, which I'm loath to do, I've taught writing fiction. I was in charge of the creative writing track when in my last gig as a professor, and I really do feel you don't teach writing. I feel you shepherd writers, and you try to shepherd them gently because. And you try to keep them alert to all the different things that go into writing. For instance, there are people who just never make it gel as a writer, but they're extraordinary editors. And all I'm saying, and I think a lot of people say, I want to be a writer, and that's a great thing. But it can also be a great thing to be a good editor. And I think actually our field is always in desperate need of those. And in some ways, now more than ever.
Not in some ways, almost in all ways.
Yeah. I'll let you get the hate mail, okay?
Oh, it's nothing new.
Well, what I mean by that, though, is so there was a problem when you had 5, 7 imprints, right? And if you didn't publish there, you weren't getting seen. You had maybe 6, 7 respected genre magazines. And if you didn't write there, you didn't get seen. You had lots of people who just, they sent in the wrong manuscript at the wrong time, or it got in front of the wrong, reader of the slush pile, or whatever the case may be. We don't know how many wonderful writers we never heard from for decades. Now, and so along comes self-publishing, along comes indie publishing, along comes Amazon. That problem is no longer really our problem. They may not come, the great voices are not always guaranteed of being the ones most heard, but they're there. It's impossible to muzzle, I think, writers today. It's harder to do that than any other day. The difficulty is that there's no gatekeeper. Except now what the traditional imprints have is a gatekeeping system, which basically, insists upon those tired matters such as, well, when you say there are 3 different ways to spell that, and they mean 3 very different things. And as I'm sure you know and have seen, there's a ton of stuff out there right now that doesn't pay attention to it and is so empowered by the technology of self-publication that it doesn't have to. And it's also breeding, I think, to some degrees, readers who are willing to say, yeah, I don't care about that either. Fill me up. And I am the last person to tell anybody what their comfort food should be, what should make them happy. I mean, that's about kind of like trying to make a cow a carnivore. It's like we're going to be made happy by what makes us happy. That may be like everybody else. It may be very, very different from everybody else, but it's what it is. But by the same token, for the first time probably since Samuel Johnson made the first supposed dictionary, I guess if you could call it that, in the English language, the English language is, I would say, opening up, I'm not sure in a good way, to permissions for all sorts of, let's say, alternate spellings, alternate grammar, alternate punctuation. And at a certain point, I always kind of see language as a dynamic equilibrium. There's the order and there's the entropy. You don't want it so hidebound that you can't introduce a new word, that you can't have a turn of phrase, that you can't invent a new metaphor and have people go, wow. Because if everything is locked down tight, you can't do any of that stuff. On the other hand, if you have too much entropy, I think that what happens is you reduce precision of expression. Because all of a sudden you can't know if what you're reading was entirely intent, or to some degree just stuff that went over the dam because there weren't filters that were going to catch it. And I think that in any system which is a dynamic equilibrium, too much order, too much entropy is not good for the system. And right now, I kind of feel like we're swinging on the entropy side, which is probably because I'm an old fogey. I don't know. But
I feel sort of the same way.
All I can say is groovy.
You are
Gnarly.
too young. You are too young to use groovy. I think I may be too young to use groovy.
But I'm not.
Point. That was my point. Language morphs. English is so malleable because it is such a diverse collection of shit from every other language on the goddamn planet. And the more people have picked it up and the more formal it's become, I mean, it is the technical language at this point.
Yep.
So all of that is getting mixed in. I've worked with folks from China, India, Europe, etc. It doesn't matter. You'll have a conversation with them. They'll be speaking in their native language, and then suddenly all the technical jargon starts coming out in English as well as the curse words. Yep. So English is starting to, I think, absorb a lot of that. And I think it's also because we're dealing with folks who didn't grow up with the language. Therefore, when they write, they're including certain ways that they think the language is supposed to work.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. It may be formal, but it's so formal it's stilted.
Yeah, well, that's and I think that's a really excellent point, and it's something that I feel I see a lot. Which is, I remember back in as far back as the 80s or the 90s when I was just starting in television, and MTV came out. Within 5 years of MTV being there, there were a lot of folks who felt that sort of history began maybe with Chubby Checkers, because occasionally they saw retro clips, and everything before that was just, gray myth. It was Tolkien-esque to them, I suppose. I think the same thing is going on. Once again, it's this dynamic equilibrium. For years, we read nothing but dead white guys. We did. It's I grew up in the 60s, and if you went from one high school to another, you could count on seeing 90% overlap in the reading list. You could see 90% overlap in what would be comprised in a civics course, all of that sort of stuff. But I was also teaching when all of that went out. And now one of your biggest challenges as a teacher, but I think it's also as a writer, is somebody has said that communication is all communication, whatever the form, is an attempt of two different intelligences to rendezvous. To rendezvous, though, you have to have coordinates.
That is correct.
Yeah, you have to have something like the same map. If you throw the canon was essentially a kind of slavery, I think, and it was a means of. I would agree with the assertion in cultural studies and elsewhere that a canon which doesn't have a lot of room for new inclusion is kind of a means of replicating a power structure. Yep. But when the answer to that is knock it all down, now you don't even necessarily have any maps anymore. You don't have any maps in common. I would be teaching kids in college, and almost none of them had read the same things. And at that point, you're faced with a different challenge, which is what basis of reference? Where's the touchstone? And what do you wind up doing? You wind up, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I would like this to be an option, not almost de rigueur forced upon you. It would be media. What are they seeing on YouTube? What did they see on TV? That becomes the touchstone. But those forms are different in all sorts of ways that very often make them poor adaptations to what I would call a more penetrating examination of narrative, language, and all the things that go with it. And I think it is always useful to be able to not just play in language and narrative, but to sort of move up in terms of. There's a reason that we don't, I hope, want to keep reading, Jack and Jill. That it's not the same riveting read at 33 that it was at 3. And I'd like to think that narrative is like that in general. and what I think is happening as both there's very little common shared basis of what people have read, and to go with what you're saying about language. Now, coming back to that is, what is correct English? What is proper English? And you can go to a dictionary or Strunk and White and find one answer. You can listen to newscasters who routinely butcher language, and then you can go to wherever your group hangs out, whatever your group is, and their language, the dominant language there and the dominant usage of it is the correct language. Because if you don't speak that way, you're marking yourself as other in that group. So we have all of this contending stuff. 50 years ago, everybody was angling towards what I would call the sort of the cultural capital on the hill, where capital I mean in both ways, was what is proper English? What is admirable rhetoric? Well, that got torn down, and probably good that it did, because it was imposing really inflexible structures in a lot of places. But now there almost is no touchstone. You're going to get a different answer on every block. Not the worst thing in the world, but not the best thing in the world either. And I do wish that once again, I sort of feel like we've gone past the point of what I would call productive entropy. And I'm not sitting there shaking a finger, because I hate to put it this way, but being a science fiction writer, I kind of guessed this was going to happen.
Yep.
Pendulums spend their least amount of time at the balance point, because that's where that is the last point. That's the maximum point of acceleration. As they go from here and they swing down, this is the last point where they're accelerating. So ironically, in a dynamic equilibrium, the place where you spend the least amount of time is at that lovely midpoint, that lovely balance point. You spend most of your time correcting with one extreme, correcting the other. I kind of feel in terms of a lot of things having to do with cultural centers of shared experience. We're seeing a lot of that friction and fraying right now, and I think it shows up just in the writing that we do and the reading that we do. So that's a really long answer, and I'm sorry.
That's okay. The way I see the language in the narrative is they're the framework which we hang our stories on, and if an individual doesn't have comfort with the framework that they can do, you've excluded them from your audience. And in a way, it's self-selecting. When you write so differently than someone else, people that appreciate that will flock to you, and those that don't understand it will not. They will leave you. And it's always a very amorphous sort of thing of people finding the voices that they like to hear and the way they like to hear stories told, while you're still telling stories that have innovation in them.
I really agree with that, and I think that to some extent, one of the things is that we talk about all these things like they're separate variables, and they're not. They're all in the pot stewing at the same time. And I think one of the things that's happened, just the number of times that television and media have come up in the course of the discussion. When I was in television, LCD back in the 70s, well, I was in television in the 80s, but you could still hear LCD mean two things. For those ancient technos amongst us, LCD was liquid crystal diode, which was a cool way to have a watch or an indicator on your alarm system, which is
That's me.
Yep, right. Okay, I resemble that remark. Or in television, lowest common denominator. And lowest common denominator. But I will tell you, that was the magic rule for when you were time buying. If it was like you were selling commercial spots, when you were doing programming, the question is, what is the lowest common denominator of your audience? And it changed throughout the day, and it changed based on region. But what's happening now, I think, is that, I'm not meaning to bash non-written media, but when you're talking about what was generated for what I would call general public consumption, that was looked at as the physical assumptions behind the idea and resources that were orchestrated to create a movie, a television program, whatever the case may be. We're always looking to throw a big footprint on a general audience, because narrowcasting was really not possible. As you move forward, narrowcasting becomes more possible. But what happens with the footprint is there's always the temptation. Actually, I was in time buying, I was in audience analysis, and I will tell you this sad fact. As you move towards let's make this more ambitious, the degree to which you extend the footprint is an increasingly narrow addition to the sum total of the footprint. As you open it up to the bottom end, it grows much larger, much faster. In other words, there is always a fiscal component, and I think it's still true today, to go to the lowest common denominator. That is therefore determining more of the language and the programming we see on TV, that we see in our cinemas, all across the board. What I found interesting, give you an example of, I'll critique something I love. I enjoyed the MCU universe. I don't know where it's going to go now, but I've enjoyed it. And yet there were some ahistoricities, particularly connected to World War II as represented as part of Captain America's story. And in some of the series that came off that, like Peggy Carter, where you're sitting scratching your head and saying, that's strictly ahistorical. And I don't mean that there was some sort of, Red Skull thing going on. I mean, there were just operations in parts of the world in years when they weren't there, and they were apparently newsworthy events and all the rest. And no one bats a lash at that, and I can tell you 30 years ago, that would not have happened. They would have been called out and crucified and it doesn't matter whether it would have been what was deemed a liberal publication like Time magazine or a conservative publication, which was, I think, was it U.S. News and World Report? But they would have both jumped on that. It wouldn't have been a political thing. That was a discourse and rhetorical thing. And now it's open. It's totally open. And that makes me wonder, when history itself can sort of be dismissed almost with an impressionist gesture, I get a little bit nervous, so that's me. And that's why I think that pardon me?
I'm sorry. I thought I was edging into a spot there, but go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll shut up real soon now. He lied horrifically. But I just sort of feel that what's going on in media is feeding back into reading tastes. I think people are willing to accept a lot of writing which doesn't bother to really check itself in structure, in form, in narrative construction. And the thing is that and now we have a technology which means there's absolutely no gatekeeping involved. So I think we're seeing a change. I'm absolutely delighted that we have more people reading more words than ever before right now. And that's something that really we owe to Amazon and indie authors. And I think that's golden. But it comes with a flip side. And that flip side concerns me. And now I'm really stopping myself here.
I'm going to go ahead and take lowest common denominator, and I'm going to reframe that. And what a lot of people were trying to do is to make their work more accessible.
Yes.
If we're going to drag it back into the writing thing, the challenge is to not go ahead and remove all standards whatsoever, because there's that threshold where you've went from having a framework to you're swimming in the ocean and the liner is now sailing out of sight and you're out in the ocean. Yeah.
No, and I agree with that. And I understand that I'm probably sounding a little bit more, perhaps there's a critical twinge to my tone, but I absolutely agree with you. It's not a black or white situation. It's shades of gray. And that's why I represent it as a dynamic equilibrium. It's a mix. And I wonder how the mix is going to swing next.
And the shades of gray are going to be colored by who the consumer is.
Yes, absolutely so. Absolutely so. And more people are buying books than ever, which tells us that to some degree the consumer body has changed. The demographic of that consumer body is much different than it was 25 years ago.
Understanding who we're writing for is always a challenge. I know that I've used a few Facebook ads, and I can tell that my reading audience is primarily my age and older. So that tells me something right there. I'm getting some younger people as well, but if you start looking at 30 and below, that cuts off way high in the numbers of people that are that's the boundary between don't read very much of my ads and do. So there's trying to get the crystal ball out and figure out who you're writing for and how you can expand that pool of people without changing what you're writing is going to be an interesting balance.
I think I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you.
Well, we've kept you for an hour, and it's been an excellent conversation. But I'd like to go ahead and close out by letting you let people know where they can find you on the web.
You can find me on Facebook as Chuck Gannon. You'll find, however, that's because the only my books, all my professional work is under Charles E. Gannon. That take the periods out behind the E and put all the letters together, and that's my website, www.charlesegannon.com. And I don't do much on Twitter. I find
no right-thinking person does.
144 characters. You can say some meaningful things, but I bear always in mind that Twitter is that word comes to us to refer to sounds made by creatures with literally the brains of birds.
And this is still true.
And now I've certainly isolated a part of the audience. Although that said, I think a lot of people use Twitter wonderfully. And it's a great medium for them. And I will look on Twitter and I will say, that's a great insight. It's very fast. If only fortune cookies were that good. I think, for instance, somebody like H.L. Mencken, who was known for these sort of really, really brief quips in the 1920s. He was part of the Algonquin table, I think, in New York, the Algonquin Club. I forget what it's called. Dorothy Parker, that whole bunch. He would have been right at home. He would have had an absolutely scathing Twitter every day. He would have millions of followers. So it's not like it's a generational thing for me. It's just that's not my conversational sort of wheelhouse. But you can find, like I said, Facebook, website. I do have an email list, which I really recommend as probably one of the best ways if you're interested in my writing to follow it, because I do a lot of exclusive giveaways there. I do a lot of exclusive snippets and sort of, I guess you could say, curtain raisers on books that have yet to come out. So that's where you can find me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a really great conversation.
Where can we find you guys?
Well,
to say it.
I'm about to say.
Okay.
Folks, if you would like to send us any information, ask a question, do something, send us a note at show@deadrobotsociety.com. If you would like to speak to somebody on Twitter, you can speak to Paul at Paul_E_Cooley, because I don't do Twitter, which says something about me as well.
Grumpy old codger.
Yes, indeed. You can find us on Facebook at the Listeners of the Dead Robot Society Facebook group. We have to thank the good folks at podhoster.com for hosting the audio versions of this show for your viewing pleasure. You can find us on youtube.com/DRS podcast. And if you would like to support us on Patreon, where for as little as $1 a month, you can get exclusive content and things that are going on behind the scenes, or even have your name read if you're a $10 patron. You can find us at patreon.com/DRS podcast. And who are our $10 patrons, Paul?
And our $10 patrons are Andrew Smallwood, J.D. Barker, Aaron Meeser, Jesse Tacos Are Life Work It, Veronica Jaguar, who's still not a possum but didn't put it down, Jack F. Erickson, Kelson, a tutor who tooted a flute, Isabel Cushy, Rick Shaw, Lisa Slack, Nathan Cosby, Cheryl Winters, Tracy Bodine, Devin Lee, Drew Subtle as a hand grenade and oatmeal Bernardi. That still just sounds like a recipe, a disgusting recipe. We'll make some interesting wall coverings, though. Chris Winder, Andre Conde Marias, and J.R. Handley. Thank you, folks, very much.
Thank you very much, folks. And Chuck, once again, thanks for coming on and joining us. It was a blast.
It was great fun. Thanks for having me on.
And with that, folks, we are out of here, and we will see you next week.
Say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.